A man gets a raise, and 6 months later he's broke again at a higher number. A man wins a windfall, and within 2 years it's gone, and he can't fully explain where. A man works himself into real income and somehow always ends the month the same distance from zero he started at a decade ago, regardless of what that number actually was. You've watched this happen, maybe to someone close to you, maybe, if you're honest, to yourself. And the explanation you were handed was always about the income, not enough of it, badly managed, spent on the wrong things. Sit with a different explanation instead, because it's the one that actually holds up under scrutiny. Income was never the ceiling. Identity was. Every man carries an internal number, mostly unexamined, that represents how much money feels like him. Go meaningfully above it, and something in his behavior quietly corrects the surplus away. A purchase that didn't need to happen. A risk that didn't need to be taken. A generosity extended at exactly the wrong moment. Fall meaningfully below it, and a different correction kicks in. The sudden hustle, the extra shift, the discomfort that won't let him rest until the number returns to where it felt right. This isn't willpower. It's closer to a thermostat, and a thermostat doesn't care what temperature you'd prefer. It only cares about the number it was set to. This is the third law of the wolf economy, and it sits underneath the first two. You already learned to stop being free and set your price. You already learned that money flows toward composure and drains away from panic. This law goes deeper than both, because a man can master his pricing and master his calm and still end every year at the same net position, because the thermostat resets him, there regardless of what he earned or how composed he stayed while earning it. 500 years ago, Machiavelli observed something adjacent to this in the rulers he studied, that a man's fortune rarely exceeds his own conception of what he's entitled to hold on to. Give a small man a large kingdom, and he will find a way to lose the parts of it that exceed his own sense of scale, not through incompetence, but through an internal ceiling he never examined, and therefore never actually raised. Before we go under, drop 3 words in the comments. Raise the ceiling. Type it, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why your income has been arguing with a number you didn't know you'd set, and why that argument, not your salary, has been deciding your net worth the entire time. Mechanism 1. The thermostat isn't a metaphor. Understand the actual mechanism before anything else, because most men treat this as a mindset problem, when it's closer to a behavioral one, a set of automatic corrections running beneath conscious awareness, executed so smoothly you rarely notice you're the one pulling the lever. Give a man raise to feel comfortable around a certain number, significantly more than that number, and watch what happens over the following months. It rarely gets invested, saved, or deployed with the same clarity he'd apply to money that felt native to him. It gets spent in ways that don't quite make sense on paper. A car he didn't need, a loan extended to someone who wasn't going to repay it, a lifestyle upgrade that arrived suspiciously, close to the moment the surplus appeared. None of this looks like sabotage from the inside. It looks like normal life. Ordinary decisions, one after another, each individually defensible. Only in aggregate does the pattern become visible. The surplus got returned to where it felt correct to be. The reverse happens just as reliably. A man whose internal number sits considerably higher than his current income will behave in ways that look, from the outside, like ambition, extra hours, second income streams, a discomfort with rest that borders on compulsive. Some of that genuinely is ambition. But a meaningful portion of it is simply the thermostat, working in the other direction, correcting a deficit the same way it corrects a surplus, because the number that feels like him sits above where he currently stands, and something in him won't fully settle until the gap closes. Machiavelli's writing on political fortune touched something similar from a different angle, describing how a ruler unaccustomed to holding significant power will frequently squander it, through decisions that seem individually reasonable, because he lacks the internal frame required to actually retain something larger than what he'd previously considered normal for himself. The power wasn't lost through a single dramatic failure. It leaked out through 100 small decisions, each one quietly correcting the ruler back toward the scale he'd unconsciously accepted as his own. Marcus Aurelius approached the underlying mechanism from the direction of self-governance, rather than fortune specifically, arguing that a mind untrained in its own habitual patterns will repeat those patterns, regardless of changing external circumstances, because the pattern lives in the mind's own operating structure, not in whatever conditions happen to be present at a given moment. Change the income without changing the internal structure processing that income, and the structure simply produces the same familiar outcome through whatever new inputs it's been given. Mechanism 2. The number was installed, not chosen. Here's the uncomfortable part. And it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. That internal number wasn't selected deliberately at any point. It was absorbed mostly before the age of 10, mostly from watching how money was discussed, handled and felt around you, long before you were capable of evaluating whether any of it was accurate or worth keeping. A household where money was discussed as scarce, dangerous, or a source of constant tension installs a low ceiling almost automatically, regardless of what that household actually earned. A household where money was treated as abundant, or simply not discussed with anxiety, installs a considerably higher one. Neither installation required a single explicit lesson. It happened through tone, through tension in a parent's voice near the mailbox, through whether financial conversations felt like crisis, management, or routine planning. Children absorb the emotional register of money years before they understand a single one of its mechanics. This is why two men can grow up in nearly identical income brackets and carry entirely different ceilings into adulthood, because the ceiling was never about the number their household actually held. It was about the emotional weather surrounding that number, and weather gets absorbed regardless of the forecast's accuracy. Seneca, writing to a friend about the nature of inherited habits, observed that most people spend their lives executing patterns they never consciously chose, mistaking the familiarity of those patterns for their own considered judgment. He argued that genuine freedom required a specific, deliberate act of examination, sitting down and asking, plainly, whether a given habit was actually yours or whether it had simply been installed, early enough that it now felt indistinguishable from your own character. Few people ever perform this examination on their relationship with money specifically, because money habits rarely announce themselves as habits. They present themselves as personality. I'm just not a saver. I've always been generous to a fault. I've never been good with numbers. Language that treats an installed pattern as an immovable trait, rather than what it actually is, a setting adjustable by anyone willing to examine it honestly. Epictetus drew a related distinction that applies directly here, separating what's genuinely within a person's control from what merely feels that way through familiarity. An installed financial ceiling feels like an accurate description of your limits. It's frequently just an old setting, mistaken for a permanent fact about who you are, because nobody ever showed you the control panel it was set from. Mechanism 3. The ceiling protects something, not just limits something. Here's why simply wanting to earn more rarely raises the ceiling on its own. The ceiling isn't just a limit. For most people, it's quietly load-bearing, holding up a set of relationships, a sense of belonging, an identity that would genuinely be disrupted if the number moved too far past where everyone around you currently sits. Rise meaningfully above the income level of your surrounding social circle, and something uncomfortable tends to happen that has nothing to do with money mechanics and everything to do with belonging. Conversations shift. Certain jokes stop landing the way they used to. A subtle distance opens that nobody explicitly created, but everyone can feel. Most people, confronted with that discomfort, will unconsciously correct their financial position back toward the group's shared level rather than tolerate the isolation of standing meaningfully apart from it, not because they lack ambition, but because belonging is a genuine need, and the thermostat in this light isn't malfunctioning. It's protecting something it correctly identifies as valuable, using the only lever it has available. This is precisely why financial growth so often triggers behavior that looks, from the outside, like self-sabotage. It usually isn't sabotage in any conscious sense. It's the system defending a social position it was never told is negotiable, using the exact tools, spending, generosity, risk, that happen to be available to it. Machiavelli's writing on maintaining a ruler's position touches something adjacent here, arguing that a prince who rises too visibly above his original peers without carefully managing that transition invites resentment and isolation in equal measure, and that the wise ruler manages his ascent deliberately, rather than allowing the ascent itself to sever every connection that originally supported him. Applied to an ordinary financial life, the lesson holds. Raising the ceiling isn't purely an internal, private act. It frequently requires consciously managing the social consequences of the rise, rather than unconsciously sabotaging the rise to avoid facing those consequences at all. Understanding this doesn't lower the ceiling's grip on its own, but it does something equally useful. It removes the shame that usually accompanies noticing the pattern. The urge to sabotage a financial gain isn't evidence of some character flaw. It's evidence of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting a form of belonging it correctly assessed as valuable, simply using an outdated method to protect it. Mechanism 4. The case of a ledger kept before there was anything to record. Now the anchor because one story illustrates this more completely than any explanation on its own. What follows is history and psychology, not financial advice, a look at how one man, long before he held any real money, built the internal ceiling required to eventually hold an extraordinary amount of it. As a teenager working an entry-level bookkeeping job earning a modest weekly wage, John D. Rockefeller began keeping a small, personal ledger, he referred to simply as Ledger A, a meticulous record of every cent earned and every cent spent, tracked with a precision that had nothing to do with the actual size of the sums involved. He wasn't tracking large amounts, he was tracking small ones. With the same seriousness, a much wealthier man might apply to a significant transaction. This detail matters more than it initially appears to. He wasn't practicing discipline because the money demanded it. A few dollars a week barely requires meticulous accounting. He was practicing discipline because he was, deliberately or not, constructing the internal identity of a man who treated money with precision and seriousness, well before his income gave him any practical reason to. By the time his income actually grew, the internal ceiling required to hold that growth had already been under quiet construction for years. The ledger didn't record wealth. It built the temperament that would eventually be capable of holding wealth once it arrived. Contrast this with the far more common pattern, a man who waits for his income to grow, before adjusting how seriously he treats money, assuming the discipline will simply arrive alongside the larger number. It rarely does. Because discipline, built in response to money already present, tends to be reactive and thin, while discipline built in advance, on money that barely justifies the effort, becomes structural. Rockefeller's early ledger wasn't really about the specific dollars it tracked. It was about installing a ceiling higher than his current income, years before his income caught up to meet it. This is the deeper lesson underneath the entire story. The habit that looked, to any outside observer, like excessive caution over trivial sums was in fact the exact mechanism by which an eventual fortune became something he was internally equipped to hold on to rather than quietly leak back out through 100 small, unexamined corrections. The precision applied to small numbers was never really about the small numbers. It was rehearsal for a ceiling that hadn't been reached yet. Mechanism 5. Raising the ceiling deliberately. Here's the part that moves this from diagnosis into something usable, because right now you might be assuming your particular ceiling is simply fixed, a permanent fact about your character rather, than a setting installed early and left unexamined since. Kill that assumption now, because it's the exact belief that keeps most men executing the same financial pattern indefinitely, regardless of how much their income eventually grows. The ceiling is raised through the same mechanism it was originally installed by. Repeated exposure, absorbed gradually, until a new number starts to feel native rather than foreign. This isn't accomplished primarily through willpower applied in the moment. Surplus arrive, because by the time surplus is already in hand, the thermostat has considerable leverage, and willpower alone rarely wins that particular fight consistently. It's accomplished earlier, deliberately. The way Rockefeller's ledger operated, treating money seriously before the amount involved technically requires it, so that the internal structure required to hold a larger number gets built, well in advance of that number actually arriving. This means examining, honestly, where your current ceiling was actually installed from, whose voice is underneath the discomfort that shows up whenever your account balance climbs meaningfully past a familiar point. It means deliberately spending time around people whose relationship with money operates at the level you're trying to grow into, not to imitate their spending, but to absorb their emotional register around money, the same way your original ceiling got absorbed from an entirely different environment years earlier. Seneca's writing on deliberate habit formation applies directly here. He argued that character isn't primarily built through occasional dramatic decisions, but through small, repeated exposures chosen consciously rather than absorbed passively. Raising a financial ceiling works through exactly this mechanism. Not a single transformative moment, but a long sequence of smaller ones, tracking money with more seriousness than its current size requires, tolerating the discomfort of a growing account without immediately correcting it back downward, sitting with unfamiliar financial territory long enough that it eventually stops feeling unfamiliar. Marcus Aurelius offered the discipline underneath all of this, the practice of noticing an automatic reaction as it arises, and consciously choosing whether to follow it or interrupt it, rather than assuming every internal impulse deserves obedience, simply because it arrived quickly and felt urgent. The moment a financial surplus starts, triggering the familiar pull toward an unnecessary purchase, an ill-timed loan, a lifestyle correction that doesn't actually serve any real need, that pull can be noticed, named, and set aside rather than automatically obeyed. Do this consistently enough, across enough individual moments, and the ceiling itself eventually moves, not because it was argued with directly, but because it was quietly retrained through repetition. The same patient way it was originally installed. Every man carries an internal number that determines how much money feels correct to hold. Installed early, defended automatically, and almost never examined directly. Income alone doesn't move it. Only deliberate, repeated exposure does. The discipline applied to small sums before they demand it. The discomfort of unfamiliar, financial territory tolerated rather, then corrected away. The ceiling raised the same patient way it was originally installed. Composure from the last law keeps you from bleeding money in a panic. This law determines the size of the container that composure is protecting. Master one without the other, and you'll simply stay calm while quietly returning. Every surplus back to a number that was never actually yours to begin with, just the one you happened to inherit before you were old enough to choose differently. Say it once more and mean it. Raise the ceiling. The number was installed. It can be reinstalled, deliberately this time, by someone finally paying attention to the mechanism instead of blaming the income. Subscribe, because this is the third law in the series on how money actually moves. The next one goes somewhere most men never expect. The specific hour of the day when the entire ceiling is most likely to move, and why almost nobody uses it. Don't miss it.